So as we talk about the West, um, in order to understand how the West became settled and populated, you have to understand who was there prior to Anglo-American settlement, in large-scale factor at least. So after the Mexican War, we had the Mexican Cession. We basically took the American Southwest now. Um, the Civil War, the application of statehood and should states allow slavery out west just really drove the question home about slavery. We fought an entire war about it and we ended slavery. But still, the West was a resource. It was vast. There are a lot of things out there. It was largely unsettled. And as you had congregations of people out east and otherwise who were still looking for mobility and opportunity, you had this whole western expanse that would become available. Okay? So, who settled there first? Well, first, you still had a significant number of Native Americans who lived out there, especially in the plains, the Dakotas, Nebraska, modern day Kansas, even parts of Texas. Okay, and then of course over into Colorado and Wyoming, New Mexico, places like that. Okay, so the Plains Indians, you have those who, like the Sioux, um, even the Comanches, Apaches, otherwise, who may make a living and subsist by hunting buffalo out on the plains. And of course, by this time in the 1870s, 1880s or so, European settlers had been in the Americas for the better part of 300 years. They had introduced livestock. Many of the Plains Indians had now become accustomed to having horses and had developed a grand horse culture, such as the Comanches, for example. The Comanches were a thriving Plains Indian tribe that pervaded much of the plains on into parts of Texas and even Mexico. They became so feared, largely because they mastered the art of the horse. And because they had horses, now they could chase after buffalo that much faster. They were more mobile now. Some of them even had access to European weaponry. Or at least if you had your primitive bow and arrow, you were at least now fast because you were on a horse. So, horse culture in and around the Comanche tribe and others like the Apaches and even the Sioux would now become ingrained in Plains Indian society. But the epicenter of the Plains Indian culture, no matter the tribe, was the buffalo, bison. Okay? Every nook and cranny of a bison was used for some sort of purpose. The meat was used for weeks to be consumed, dried, salted, kind of like maybe a primitive beef jerky, if you will. I love beef jerky. That's some good stuff, man. I just love beef jerky. Um, well, how about buffalo beef jerky? Because that's what a lot of Plains Indians survived on. They would use the hide for coating, for their teepee, their housing, or maybe for a semi shelter or for warmth in the winter cold. They would use various different parts of their bones to make primitive weapons or even parts of various different forms of pottery even. You Oftentimes it was a rite of passage for a young Plains Indian who may have killed his first buffalo to take a bite out of a tongue of a freshly killed bison or something else of that sort. Every single nook and cranny of a bison was used for some sort of useful purpose. So the buffalo roamed all across the plains of modern day America back then. A couple different things happened. The Plains Indians were very vulnerable, as had Native Americans been in the past 300 years at that point. They were vulnerable to Eastern diseases. So as you had more and more Anglo-white settlement coming further and further west, they had more and more exposure to smallpox and other forms of diseases that would cause real harm. Okay, I've heard talks and I've heard other historians, and there's a lot of arguments back and forth about how uh, blankets that had been exposed to smallpox would be offered to Native Americans so they would all get it and die off. I don't know if that's true. Some of that seems like folklore. I don't think it's not plausible. I think it could have happened. I just don't. I've never seen any concrete evidence. But that's one of their vulnerabilities. And then, as you had more and more settlement, you had the hunting of bison for sport. People would oftentimes hunt buffalo because they could. Now, that's different than like hunting for deer under licensure of the state of Texas, and you have various different regulations to control populations and such. Deer season exists for a reason, and there are laws around that to control the population. There was no such thing anywhere in the plains back in the 1800s. So you oftentimes had populations of buffalo that would be wiped out of entire vast regions. And that exposed some of the vulnerabilities of the Plains Indians around there at the time. And then, of course, you would also have conflict with white settlers moving out west as well. So the problem for Native Americans in that instance is that most of them did not want white settlement anywhere nearby. However, they oftentimes were rivals among each other. As I've said in human history, humans often don't play nice. And you may have a genuine common cause, but you also hate your rival, and it prevents you from coming together to fight on the same cause. You would sometimes have guides from other rival tribes protecting soldiers or protecting white settlers from marauding Native Americans. Okay? So it was often difficult for natives to actually do something about that. Now, as far as some of the places in the American Southwest itself, you may look at New Mexico, for example. After the Mexican Cession, after the Mexican War, many of the much of the Hispanic population, whether they were old Spanish colonial populations or if they were settlers that came up from Mexico or anything else of the sort, if they had land in New Mexico, California, Arizona, or Texas, they now became foreigners in their own homes. That's a very distinct reality. That was a reality for my ancestors. My ancestors came from northern Spain in the mid 1700s, and they settled in what is present day Zapata County, Texas, just south of Laredo. Since the 1750s, my dad's family has been in South Texas. Of course, I grew up in South Texas, but now I live up in the Dallas area, so Texan nonetheless, but not in South Texas anymore. Over time, my dad's family became foreigners in their own colonies. Okay, so we'll talk about that in a second. But you have a westward expansion that goes into New Mexico. And part of the reason we had talked about the Gadsden Purchase, that little strip of southern Arizona and New Mexico, was because railroads needed to have been, to get from El Paso to Yuma, Arizona, or even Los Angeles in California, they needed more direct desert passway. Well, because of that, you have more and more railroads that had been built. And because you have more railroads that can get built, you start attracting more people from various other different corners of the country. And you essentially bring so many new Anglo-American white settlers that you completely overpopulate, or rather overcome, the existing Hispanic population in New Mexico. That creates a different political environment. That creates a different aspect of opportunity lost for Hispanics in New Mexico. And it creates strife and this tension. Whereas in colonial New Mexico, things had been a little bit different previously. You had commonality that The Hispanic settlers and the Native Americans kind of partnered with one another a little bit more so, but much of that was gone. Um, Same thing happened in California. California had been uh, set up with missions all across by the Spanish colonists um, prior to the Mexican independence movement. And when Mexico took over, they kind of took a step back. They kind of removed the Catholic Church from much of California's presence. When California was ceded to the United States and then the gold rush happened, you had an onslaught of people coming to California bringing their Anglo religions, Anglo faiths and Protestant religions, and now you would overtake much of whatever was left over of California's Catholic legacy, which had been somewhat removed by the New Mexican government um, in the 1820s and 30s before the war with the United States. In Texas, as I had mentioned, my family um, had been in what is present day Zapata County since the 1750s or so. They were offered land grants by the Viceroyalty in and around modern day Monterrey, and that was different for my family because over the course of the next few decades, as the Republic of Texas took over, and then of course cession to the United States, part of the Confederacy, and then back to the United States, in the Constitution of 1876, the Texas Constitution that is, many of the Tejanos that were there were somewhat excluded. Much of their claims to the land that had been stripped away from them went by the wayside because of the Texas Constitution. So, essentially, my dad's family became foreigners in their own land. And in a sense, they lost a lot of their political power. And because of which, well, you become maybe somebody who has land, maybe you've got a few animals, but you don't have opportunity after that. Typically, a lot of Tejanos in Texas were confined to working more menial ranch type jobs because you may have had land, but that's it. You didn't have anything else. You didn't have business. Okay? All the commerce was happening elsewhere if you were even allowed. Okay? So the plight of Hispanics in California and Texas was pretty meager. Now let's talk about Chinese immigration. Okay? Issues in China had caused many immigrants from China to leave, and they didn't just come to the United States. They came to various parts of Latin America, Australia, Hawaii, various different places around there that provided opportunities. A lot of them came as a result of the gold rush in California. And if you think about the West Coast, I mean, it's right across the Pacific. It makes sense. If they're coming to the United States, they're going to come to the Pacific. Well, you have the gold rush, which encouraged more Chinese immigrants to come. And then, of course, you also have railroads that are being built. You have many Mexican immigrants working in the railroads. Same thing with Chinese immigrants. You have many Mexican immigrants working in Western mines. You have a lot of Chinese immigrants doing the very same thing. Okay. There came so many Chinese immigrants that they would oftentimes congregate in cities like San Francisco, by the way, which has a very vibrant Chinatown to this day. You have very strong communities within larger urban areas where you might have more of a benevolent type self-serving society that enables a self-preservation aspect in an immigrant form to exist. Okay? So many of these things helped Chinese immigrants to produce Chinatowns. Oftentimes, white workers and even Mexican workers would somewhat resent many of these Chinese workers because they'd be willing to do less work, or rather, they'd do more work and accept less for it. Okay? That drives the market down. So much so that there was a lot of anti-Chinese sentiment that the United States government in 1882 came up and passed the Chinese Exclusion Act, which put a severe limit and restriction on the number of Chinese immigrants that would be enabled and allowed entry into the United States, and it restricted process for becoming citizens and citizenship in the United States as well. Those vast exclusions specifically targeted Chinese immigrants and really put a damper on them. And it had a dramatic effect on the Chinese population. It showed a decline in the Chinese population as well. And it basically stopped the flow. It worked as it was designed. Okay? Nowadays, you hear a lot about various different things within the Trump administration about immigrants this, immigrants that, restrict immigration. That's nothing new in our nation's history. That's been going on. That certainly does not excuse anything. It doesn't excuse xenophobia, but it explains where some of the mindset comes. Okay? So we'll finish up the rest of this chapter in the next video.